The parts of the constitutional process that worry me are actually two other parts. And one was one that Amr talked about. Because there is so much focus on what I would consider to be the symbolic and the religious provisions, there's a little bit less of a focus on nuts and bolts, and especially about executive authority, which has been the Achilles heel of past Egyptian constitutional documents, and I would say in the Arab world more generally. Mechanisms of accountability are simply very weakly developed. And what I see emerging out of the Constituent Assembly in Egypt right now, I would describe as a presidential document masquerading as a semi-presidential document. They simply haven't given enough attention to the fine print of how it is that there is going to be meaningful political oversight from various structures, most especially the parliament, but not exclusively the parliament, over all parts of the political process. So if I were to give any advice to the Constituent Assembly, I would say just come to your agreement on religious issues and move on, because this really needs your serious attention. It really needs a serious attention to think about things like how you're going to form a majority government, what kind of mechanisms of oversight there will be for the parliament over the security services, what kind of real meaningful guarantees will there be for judicial independence, and so forth and so on. And the second problem with the constitutional process that I see developing is, in a sense, similar to what I talked about for the political process as a whole. What kind of negotiation is going on? Again, a real interesting story out of Egypt yesterday. The Ministry of Defense says that Article so-and-so about trying barring military courts from trying civilians is unacceptable. Now think about that for a second. Who is writing this Constitution? It sounds to me that an awful lot of what the actual drafting that is going on is again, various parts of the Egyptian state negotiating with each other. So the judiciary shows up with their demands. A body called, one of the noisiest bodies is something called the State Cases Authority, and I couldn't explain to you, but that would probably take me about 10 minutes rather than 2 minutes, what the State Cases Authority actually is, but they're very noisy in making particular demands of the Constitution. The judiciary is showing up, Al-Azhar is showing up, and imagine if you were to have a Constitution drafting in this country where the United States decided a new Constitution, and people from the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Internal Revenue Service and the FBI and the federal judiciary and so forth and so on just showed up and said, okay, here's what we need to see in the document, so that it winds up that the Egyptian state is constituting the document rather than being constituted by it. And the role for essentially civil political forces in this gets a little bit marginalized. It's not, to me, the ideal way to come up with a consensus document, but it's a very good way of entrenching existing authorities and essentially giving each one of them probably a little bit more autonomy than would be justified, I think, and insulating them in a sense from any kind of oversight of any political process. In sum, then, when I think about this as a whole, and I compare Egypt of 2012 to Egypt of 2010, I say this is a healthier political climate. There are real issues being debated, and there are real alternative visions being offered the Egyptian people. This is fundamentally a freer and more pluralistic environment. And it is one in which various political forces in Egyptian life have some purchase, have some way to pursue their visions. So big picture, yes, there's something that is very healthy that has happened in Egypt that I don't think can be easily reversed. But when I look to the nitty-gritty of how this is happening, I still have a gnawing concern in my stomach that 5 years from now, what we will see is something that I called in a different context the wrong Turkish model of a I'm sorry, now I'm going to have to end on a sad ending, but one in which you have essentially one dominant political party that operates within what still is a meaningfully democratic system, but one which cannot be really effectively challenged by other political actors, and which slowly, in a sense, molds the state to its own image. I think that's better than where Egypt is coming from in 2010, but I still think it would be a disappointing outcome if, in light of the high hopes of the Egyptian revolution. Thank you.
Thanks, Nathan. Our next speaker is another Dr. Brown, Jonathan Brown, also a professor. Jack Brown is Associate Professor of Islam and Muslim-Christian Relations at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. He received his doctorate in Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations from the University of Chicago, my hometown. In 2006, Dr. Brown's book publications include The Canonization of Al-Bukhari and Muslim, The Formation and Function of the Sunni Hadith Canon, Hadith, Muhammad's Legacy in the Medieval and Modern World, and Muhammad, A Very Short Introduction. He has published articles in the fields of Hadith, Islamic law, Sufism, Arabic lexical theory, and pre-Islamic poetry, and is the editor-in-chief of the Oxford Encyclopedia of Islamic Law. Dr. Brown's current research interests include the history of forgery and historical criticism in Islamic civilization and modern conflicts between late Sunni traditionalism and Salafism in Islamic thought. And with such a profound understanding of Islamic history and Islamic theology and Islamic law, we are going to hear from Professor Brown on the role of Islamists, in particular the Salafis, in Egyptian society.
Thank you very much for inviting me. This is a very distinguished panel. I'm honored to be on it. The first thing to keep in mind when we speak about Salafis and Salafi Islam is that this is a theological and legal school of thought. It's not a political movement. It's not a political school of thought. And what happens when it gets mapped onto the political scene is that the term becomes very problematic. And I think it's misused so often in both the Arabic and the English language press that sometimes I think we should just stop using the term Salafi altogether. Because what happens is you end up talking about very different entities using the same term and then being confused about why these entities are just behaving differently. So just briefly to talk about the four different groups that are referred to broadly by the term Salafi in Egypt. The first is what's called the Da'wah Salafiyya, or the Salafi Call organization, which is a very prominent, influential, Alexandria-based Salafi group, and with its own history, its own unique experience with the Mubarak state. And this is the main force behind the Noor political party, which received 25% of the vote in the parliamentary elections. So this is the most powerful. The Noor party is a political expression of the Salafi Call, Da'wah Salafiyya organization from Alexandria. The second major group of people who are called Salafis are Salafis who are either linked to the Muslim Brotherhood or in the Muslim Brotherhood. The third group, a sort of amorphous body of more independent Salafi scholars, many of them very politically quietist at the doctrinaire level. In other words, they don't get involved in politics because they consider this to be Islamically unacceptable. And finally, the last group, which is really completely inaccurate, is inaccurately referred to as Salafis. And I think we should just sort of dismiss it as something we discuss when we talk about Salafis in Egypt, because it's so unrelated, are the so-called Salafi jihadis operating in northern Sinai. These groups are completely different and are much more involved with the Gaza area and Israel-Palestine question, and are not can't be really talked about under the same rubric as the Salafi groups in mainstream Egyptian life and Egyptian political life. Why is it important to distinguish between these four groups? Because they behaved very differently politically. When the Salafis, quote unquote, got involved in politics after the revolution, people came out and said, why are you getting involved in politics now and trying to be involved in the revolution? Before you didn't care. That's not true. The Salafi Call in Alexandria had a very strong political opinion during the Mubarak and Sadat years, and they decided strategically not to be involved in politics, but that's not because they were against the idea of being involved in politics. They just didn't see it as being practical at that point. When you look at, let's say, the first round of presidential elections, when the Salafi vote was split between people voting for Abdelmenem Abu Fatouh and the Egyptian Brotherhood candidate, the reason why there's a split in the Salafi ranks there is because some of them are in the Muslim Brotherhood and some of them are not in the Muslim Brotherhood. To speak briefly about the main Salafi party in Egypt, the Noor party, which of course right now is extremely influential in drafting the constitution, its history is very interesting and important. The Salafi Call organization in Alexandria made a considered decision to start a political party after the Egyptian Revolution. And I think that this political party was very maturely designed. It's very interesting, which was that it was never supposed to affect negatively the primary work of the Salafi call organization, which is religious education and religious preaching. And the sense was, the second this political party or politics starts affecting our main activity of religious activism, it can be detached, basically, like a gecko's tail. It can just sort of fall off. Now, that is, I think, a very mature way to think about politics and religion. The problem is that it makes it the existence of the Nur Party is very tenuous in relation to the Salafi call organization, the religious organization in Alexandria. The main purpose of Salafi involvement, Alexandrian Salafi involvement in politics after the revolution, was one, to work to promote or to work to protect conservative Muslims in Egypt who had suffered so severely under the oppressive legal regime of Mubarak Egypt. And two, to move the country more towards Sharia compliance and the rule of Sharia law. These were the two main goals. Now, what you've seen since the formation of the party is the emergence more and more of serious tensions within the Nur Party and between it and the religious scholars or the kind of religious leadership of the Salafi movement in Alexandria. And these tensions have emerged because the party really has to deliver results. It has to really be able to say, we're advancing the interests of Salafis. We're moving towards a more Sharia-compliant state. A lot of the Salafi political operators who are in the Nur Party have a broader agenda, which I think is also a laudable agenda, which is that they want to move Egypt more towards, good governance, economic productivity, rule of law, things that are broadly acceptable and laudatory or laudable in Egyptian political life. The problem is, it's very difficult to sell these ideas to a religious constituency that sees as one of its main priorities making some specific changes in the way the state sees or defines Sharia law. And so these tensions have emerged, and if they continue if they continue to grow, I think what it will mean is very serious doubts about whether the Nur Party will have a showing that's anywhere near as good as the showing it had in the earlier parliamentary elections. When you talk about getting results, this gets us to the current issue of the constitutional, the draft of the Constitution. The current interest of not just the Nur Party, but also conservative Islamists from also within the Muslim Brotherhood, who are on the Constitutional Drafting Committee, is to push the Egyptian Constitution's recognition of Sharia forward. So beyond what it was in the 1970s and 1980 revision of the Constitution, to a more overt recognition of the rules of the Sharia as the primary source for law in Egypt. This is very important, even just as a symbolic victory, because it would mean that this very conservative Islamist group could return to their constituents and say, these are the results we've gotten. And I know that oftentimes people think, why are these minor differences in wording so important? It's very important to conservative Islamists who consider the state's commitment to Sharia law to be absolutely essential for that state's legitimacy. To be absolutely essential for that state's legitimacy.